Aloha and welcome to this practice WOD called Digits Part 4. So far, things have been relatively straightforward in terms of making digits, and this is where we're going to kind of have a little bump in the complexity because in this WOD we're going to experience how to do forms, and um, forms are a little complicated because it involves interaction between a number of different kinds of things. It, of course, involves um, Meteor because we need to somehow get data that's valid into the underlying schema. It involves semantic UI because our forms have to use semantic UI classes to be rendered in this pleasing modern way. It also involves HTML because we have these form controls that semantic UI wraps, and they have to be present as well. And so all of these three things, HTML, semantic UI, and Meteor, have to interact in kind of a coordinated fashion. And what you're going to find is that it doesn't take a lot of code to do this, but it does take some understanding of how all of these things work together. And so the first time you do this WOD, you may be stumbling along, but I recommend that you do this WOD at least a couple times because I think that if you do it multiple times, you'll run into different problems each time, and that will make you aware of the kinds of mistakes that typically occur and then what you do to overcome them. Okay, particularly when you get into a WOD situation, you want to encounter mistakes that you've seen before. You don't want to encounter something for the first time in a WOD. And the only way you kind of raise the odds of that happening is by repeating these WODs multiple times so that you make different mistakes each time and you see different things. That's my experience. I make different mistakes every time. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the add contact page, which we can see. I think I have, so I have digits running, and we have the add contact page. And right now it's just your basic HTML, but we're going to change it so that when we actually press the submit button, we validate these fields, essentially making sure that there's a value in there, and then we update the underlying collection so that then we see the results in our table. So that's the goal. How are we going to do it? Well, we quit. This is kind of an advisory that before you start this, make sure the final version of your previous WOD has been merged back into master, and then now for this WOD we'll make a branch off of master, and that means that if when you finish this you want to go back and do it again, you basically just switch back to the master branch, which is going to contain the state of your system, of your digits, right before you started this WOD. Okay, and that's a good thing for WODs. It's also a good thing to learn to do, because that's the way when we get into our final project and you're working with others, you're going to have this idea of merging into master when you've completed a chunk of work. So it's good practice for multiple reasons. The other thing to note is that whenever you're switching back and forth between branches, and particularly when the branches kind of have a system in a different state, make sure that you quit Meteor first, invoke Meteor reset to clear out the contents of the database, and then re-invoke Meteor after you switch the branch. That way you don't have Meteor blowing up for spurious reasons, reasons related to the branching and switching and Git rather than actually your code itself. So this makes sure that the problems are actually due to what you're doing. To start up Meteor, you can use Meteor npm run start. I'm not sure whether I referred to these in the previous WOD or not, but let me just quickly go through what this means. Meteor npm run start seems like you're waving a dead chicken. What do all these little words mean? Let me just break it up for you because it's really quite simple. When we say Meteor, we're saying we're going to invoke the Meteor program, and then we're going to pass the Meteor program an argument. When the argument is npm, it means we are going to use the version of npm. This command is actually going to run npm with the version of npm that was installed with Meteor. It turns out when you install Meteor, it installs its own custom version of npm. Now, for this class, we've also invoked we've installed globally a version of npm, which IntelliJ refers to. And so this is in fact important to tell to make sure that the version of NPM you're running is the version that Meteor has installed, so that that NPM is compatible with all the other stuff in Meteor. Okay, so now we're running the Meteor version of NPM, and now we're just going to run an npm command, and it turns out that the npm run command is a command that says, look in the package.json, and inside here, look for the scripts field, and inside there's going to be a bunch of strings that indicate commands to be run. Okay, and so when we look at Meteor npm run start, we're saying run the script called start in the package.json associated with wherever we're running this npm run. Okay, and so the start string is in fact this command. Okay, and that just basically says run Meteor. We're not going to check for a new release of Meteor because that slows down the running of Meteor. And we're going to use the settings file in this particular directory, okay, which is up and down into the config directory. So let's just see how that works. So if I were to say, which I did say, if I say Meteor npm run start, what you can see is that it actually shows you the command that ends up being run, which is exactly what we just see up here. Okay, so Meteor npm run start, that's 4 words, but that's a lot easier to type than this whole long string here. And you can invent, create your own scripts as well, and you just say Meteor npm run, and then the name of your script, and it will do whatever you have it there. So that's a big time saver, and also prevents typing errors. I will say that. Okay, so finally for this WOD, we need to adapt code from the Meteor example form system. So what I recommend you do is you make sure before you start this WOD that you have Meteor example form downloaded. And even more importantly, before you start this WOD, please watch the screencast associated with Meteor example form and go through this system. This, if you haven't looked at Meteor example form before, you should stop this right now and devote the next probably 30 minutes to an hour looking through Meteor example form. Okay, you've really got to do that spade work. If you just jump into this digits WOD without having spent some serious time with Meteor example form, you're just gonna not have any clue what's going on when I get to this part, because I'm not going to go through the Meteor example form stuff in detail because I did that in this other video. Okay, so it's vitally important that you have a basic familiarity with Meteor example form prior to doing this digits WOD. Okay, so there's another caveat for this. Okay, but I will say this, if you understand this Meteor example form, this stuff will go in a pretty straightforward fashion, is my goal. Okay, so all that said, I think it's time for us to start. So we're going to start our timer, which is here, and then we're going to create a branch called add contact 1. So we'll go to digits and we'll say create a branch add contact 1, and then we'll remove auto publish. So we're going to say Meteor remove auto publish at the command line. So I'll copy that, I'll go find the command line, and I'll control C out, and then I'll do Meteor remove auto publish. And it just turns out that when you're using forms, and basically when you're using Meteor and anything but the most demo-ish kind of thing, that you should remove auto publish. And so we're going to just start up Meteor again, so we get a little better sense of what's going on. Let me just wait and see that it's running, so that we're we're the least possible confused, and we have the best, we catch any errors right when they occur. So we're at localhost 3000, and I can just refresh this, for example, and everything looks fine. I can go to digits. Well, interestingly, everything's not fine. We've removed auto publish, so on the home page we don't see any data, and that's because now we've gone into this mode of saying if the client wants to see data from the server, it has to actually subscribe to the specific data that it wants to get. That's what auto-publish takes away. Auto-publish says basically all the data on the server is automatically present on the client. Now we're saying that we have to explicitly issue a call to the subscribe function for each page that wants data. And this is a big important thing that you want to do. You don't want to just publish every single darn byte of data on a server. That's completely non-scalable. So this is really a feature, even though it seems like it's a little bit of a pain, but it's necessary. So this is our next thing. We're going to publish the context. We're going to add a file named publications.js to import server startup. Model this file on the publications.js file in meteor example form. Okay, so here's how I think we should do that. We'll go to meteor example form. In import startup server, here's the publications.js, and it shows in meteor example form we're going to publish the student data, but in digits we're going to publish context. But let's use this file as an example. Now IntelliJ has a nice way to copy files. I can just press Propeller C in this project and go over to digits and see Meteor Startup Server, select that directory, do Propeller V, and it will copy this entire file over into this directory. Now remember, we have to add this. We have to add an import so that this file will actually be loaded, right, when the system starts up. Note that I add the .js here. That's optional. It will default to .js, but just for consistency, I'm doing that. Okay, so let's look at this publications file. And the issue is that we have to be loading the contacts, imports API context, context.js. That's the data that we actually want, and we're going to call it contacts. So let's just make these edits right here. And we'll just say we're going to publish this string. We'll call the string contacts, and then what we're publishing is the cursor associated with this particular MongoDB collection. So basically, context.find it returns an object that's called a cursor, which basically represents all of the documents in that particular collection. And maybe we call this publish contact data, so it's a little more descriptive. Okay, so that's the publications. We've added a file called publications.js. Be sure to update the index.js file. Done that. Now we're going to subscribe to context. So now we've told the way that it works is on the server side you say here's a function which has a name, in this case, or it has a string identifier for it called contacts. So we have this publication with a unique string called contacts, and if someone on the client side, if a page on the client side wants access to some data, it can basically subscribe to this string which says, okay, on this page I want to have access to whatever this function is going to return. And in this case, this function says it's going to return all the contacts. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether you're logged in or not. Anybody can get at this data. Okay, and that's just the way Digits is designed. We're not yet worrying about authorization or authentication. Okay, so now we have to do a subscribe. And so what I recommended is in Meteor example form, you can go to the edit student data page, and on the onCreated you'll see, okay, there's this subscribe. All this other stuff is irrelevant for this particular page, but we do want that subscribe. And there's a couple ways we can do it. The way I prefer to do these things is to copy the entire function, this onCreated function, and then I'm going to take out the stuff I don't need. So over here back in the digits, I'm going to go to Add Contact Page, and I'm going to put in a template add contact page on created. Now I need this template import, so I'll do a propeller C just to select the whole line and copy it, and then I can go back to here and I can do a propeller V to insert the import. Okay, and now the only thing I need there is I'm going to do a propeller delete to get rid of these entire lines. This is all I need to do is to subscribe, and I need to supply the correct string from my publication. So in publications I say contacts is the string. So in my subscription I use contacts as well, and that means in the on contacts page I'm now going to be subscribing to contacts. So if all goes according to plan, we've now created a connection between the server, a piece of the data in the database on the server, the contents of that single collection contacts, and a single page on the client, the add contact page. Okay, so if we go now to here, we see that we're restarting. Okay, so Meteor's restarted. And then if we go here and look at digits, what we see is it didn't happen. So let's look and see that was okay. Okay, so let's go back and say in digits, add contact page subscribes to contacts. Here's, oh, it's not add contact page. Silly me, it's the home page. So let's go to homepage.js and put this in here. And so we'll save that, and we'll wait to see for it to restart. It restarts, and bam, everything's fine. Okay, so good. I made a little error. I like doing that in these WADs because, apart from the embarrassment, now I'm noticing that there's an ESLint error right here. New line required at the end of the file, so I'll add the new line, save it out, get rid of the ESLint error. Okay, it goes to green. And then here, I am going to remove this because I'm going to actually remove everything because I don't want the ESLint errors and because it's inappropriate. So going back to digits part 4, so now we published, we subscribed, and that means that we now have the home page working again, okay, which is what we want. Next thing is to provide the semantic UI form control templates. So we need to copy the import UI components form controls directory from Meteor example template into digits. Okay, and then import that file in client main.js. So to do that, we'll go back to IntelliJ, and we'll go back to Meteor example form. And this is the directory we want. We've got all sorts of different forms in here. It turns out the only one we're going to really want is the text form control, but my view is, who knows, we may want to be expanding this form later. Let's just take our little library of form controls and throw it in there, and we'll have them if we need them. So the way I'm going to do that is do a propeller C on this components directory, and then go back over to digits, and then in UI I'm going to paste the components directory, and there we can see we have all our form controls. Now the only thing we have to do is make sure that we import that in our main.js. So let's go back to Meteor example form, and we go to main.js. We can see this is the line we want, so I'll copy it, and then I'll move back to digits, and I'll go up to main.js, and I'll paste it in. Okay, so now we've got our form controls. That was pretty easy. So the next thing we're going to do is update the add contact page.html. And so we're going to use the file create student data page from Meteor example form. We're going to update add contact page so that the form's HTML is appropriate for form submission. It's fine if the labels change slightly, check your contact schema to determine if fields are required or not. Okay, so how does that work? Well, the first thing we need to look at is create student data page from meteor example form. So let's go there, and we scroll down, create student data page. So this is what it looks like, and of course, since you've all watched the screencast and played around with this, what you can see is that we have a form, we have a class that is used to with our event handler to determine which submit button has been pressed, and then we have success and failure, which are inserted into this form element as attributes in the case that the form succeeded or the form failed. The success, in the case of meteor example template, we have the success class in order to display a little this thing at the bottom, right? A success message at the bottom. But in the case of digits, we're not displaying anything at the bottom, so it turns out this whole success class thing is not necessary at all. We do, however, want to include the error class, because if we don't supply a required field, for example, in digits, we want to display errors. And Semantic UI requires there to be a class called error as an attribute in the UI form set of classes, CSS classes, in order to display error messages. That's just the way it works. Okay? So in the case of digits, all we have are text form controls. So we're going to want to only use this guy. But we've got to start out by including a class, student data form, and this error class in this field. So what I'm going to do to start is I'm going to copy this whole thing from here, and then I'm going to go over to the add contact page .html, which only says UI form, and I'm going to expand it to say UI form contact data form. And we don't need this success class because we're not displaying anything on when it's successfully submitted. In fact, we're going to go from this page to the home page when things are successful. On the other hand, we do need to display errors, so we need this error class helper to be invoked. Okay, so that's that. And what you can see is that every single field is just a text field. This is a really simple form compared to meteor example form. Hallelujah, something simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select that line and copy it, go back to digits, and instead of this whole piece of text right here, div class field with an input inside, I'm going to replace that by, actually let me put it back in for a second, whoops. I'm going to replace it by a label first, okay, and a error message first. Okay, now this needs to refer to a string, I'm sorry, not in the right spot, one of these labels here, okay? So in your schema, you're defining a set of field names, and in the this particular handler, it wants to know the name of the field name that for which an error message should be printed out in the event that the validation for this field fails. Okay, so I'm claiming that this text form control line here is going to replace this div here. Okay, why is that true? Well, to see why that's true, we just kind of can go to the text form control, and you can see we've got a div, we've got a label, then we've got a field, okay, and then we print out an error message, and we end that div. Okay, so that's why we can replace this div by that text form controls. In fact, it includes the class field, but a bunch of other stuff as well that we didn't even think about when we were just making the mock-up. So that's kind of good news for us. Okay, so the second thing is now we see that actually all of these things are just these text form fields, so we can just basically duplicate this, and we can say last, And we can make them required because it turns out, or we should make them required, because it turns out that optional is false for every single one of our fields. So because that's the case for our schema, we need to make required be true for all of our form controls. Okay, so this is last, field error last, and we've done that one. And then I'll copy this line, and then this next one is address, so I'll just replace it here and put address, and then address, which is the name of the field in the schema. And then here we've got a telephone, so we put a text form control telephone, oops, and telephone, and then this is email, and then the field in the schema is email. And then let's just get rid of some of these blank lines. And there we go. That's pretty good. In fact, this is smaller and now we can get rid of this particular label. Actually, we'll just see what it looks like and then we'll know to get rid of it. And even this label we can get rid of. But it's looking a lot better. So let's go back and see the client has refreshed. And then if we go to digits and we go to add contact, what we can say is this is almost perfect except for these superfluous labels here. So let's go back to IntelliJ. Let's delete that, propeller delete to delete that line. Good to learn these, not having to swipe with the mouse, because that takes, extra milliseconds. And then we can go back to Google Chrome, and this looks pretty darn good. Okay, notice now we've got these little stars, these little red asterisks indicating these fields are required, which they are, which our mockup didn't have. The placeholder is not exactly the same. We can add that. Maybe we can do that just for grins for one of them. We could say like placeholder equals first name. Like we could add that as an option if we wanted to. And then if we go back here, what we'd see is now we have a placeholder that's different from the value of the label. So you'll see these form controls allow you to explicitly specify all these things, but I'm just going to say for the purpose of this WOD, let's just keep the code as simple as possible, knowing that we can go in and modify this stuff and make it as nice as we want later on. Okay, so that's takes us back to here. So we've now updated the add contact page, and it's fine if the labels have changed slightly, which they have, and then we've checked the contact schema to determine if fields are required or not. They all are required, so we're going to make them all required. And so we can go on to number 8, which is to update the add contact page. We're going to use the file createStudentDataPage.js as the template, as the example, and we're going to update add contact page so that we can actually process the form when you click the submit button, because that's the whole point, right? We've got this, now we've laid out this file, but we still haven't given this submit button any behavior. So that the final step is providing that. So what we'll do is we'll go to Meteor Example Form again, and we'll go to this Create Student Data Page, which is the one we want as our example. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to actually basically do a propeller A to select the whole thing and a propeller C to copy the whole thing. And then I'm going to go into digits, and I'm going to find add contact page, which has nothing right now. I'm going to paste this whole sucker in. And then I'm going to kind of go through with you and talk through how we modify this to work for what we need in this case. The first thing is that we need to import the contact stuff. So this is from contacts.js, Okay, and what we need to import is contacts and contact schema. Okay, if you don't believe me, you can just go to contacts and you can see we have contacts and we have contact schema. Okay, and those are the two things. We need to know the schema because we're basically going to be validating our input values from the form against this schema. And the second thing we need is the actual collection, because once we have data that we believe is valid, then we want to insert it into this collection. Okay, so let's go back here. And then, as I said before, we don't do anything on success. So there's some extra processing I showed you in meter example form to actually display a page when the data is successfully input, but we don't have to do that. So we can actually get rid of that. On the other hand, we do need to display error messages, so we're going to keep this piece around. The other thing is that in meter example form, I show you how to deal with selection lists and checklists and radio buttons and all of those things, and multi-select lists, and all of those require, you know, some structure, like what are the set of checklist items and what are the set of radio button items. And those structures have to be present for both the add and the edit pages. So I create those data structures here so they can be shared, they can be defined in one place and used in both forms. But we just have text fields. So none of this stuff actually applies to us. Hallelujah. Next thing is we need to change our template handlers to actually be the name of this page, which is add contact page. So I'm going to copy that, and then I'm going to do a propeller R to say change create student data page to add contact page. There's 3 matches. We're going to replace all of them. And then now this is going to have the correct value, and that's very important. Okay, so I've deleted, this says we haven't used them yet, that's okay. But I've deleted display success message, so that's kind of nice. ESLint is telling us lines where that exists, and I can tell you that wherever you see that, you can just kind of delete that line because we're not going to need it. And now this needs to be contact schema rather than you know, the student data schema. Now we could say, we can actually call this anything we want, but it's a little better if we use a name that makes sense. So we'll call that add contact page. So we're setting up a context. This is a simple schema idea that when you're doing validation, you create this thing called a context inside the schema, which enables you to validate against, you could have a single schema and then multiple contexts, and they're all validating for stuff on different pages, different forms, and so forth, and it keeps everything separate. Okay, so success class we can delete because that's just dealing with a success message. Display success message we can delete because it's dealing with success message. Error class, we need that one. Field error, we need that one. All of these helpers deal with displaying these drop-down lists and the checklists and the radio buttons and so forth. We don't need any of those, so we get rid of that. And in fact, these are the only 2 helpers that we need. We need to know if an error exists, and then we need to figure out what the error message should be displayed, what error message should be displayed in a form based upon the field name. Okay, so those are the only 2 things left. Now, this we have to change to contact data form, right? Because in our add contact page, we're calling this class contact data form. So this event handler, right, is triggered when a submit button is pressed in a form which includes the class contact data form. Okay, and that's what we're talking about right here. We're in a form. Okay, the submit button is pressed, and that form includes the class contact data form. So now we could have another form in this same page, and we could have some different class specified there, and we'd be able to distinguish between those 2 submit buttons. That's the only reason we have that. In fact, in this case, we wouldn't necessarily even need to have that class because we only have one form. But it's so important to kind of understand how to do that that I just always provide that to uniquely identify which form on a page is actually being interacted with. Okay, Now, we've got, in meter example form, we show how to get a text field, how to get a text area, how to get checkboxes, you know, radio button, single selection, multiple selection. The only kind of thing we want is a text field for digits. So the great news is we can get rid of all this stuff. It doesn't apply to us. The only thing that applies is that we want to, when we want to get the first name, we use first, whoops, sorry, because there's our label first, okay? And that means that the name field for this is also going to be first because everything defaults to the value of the label. And so we're going to have a variable called first, which is going to be the value of the first form control, which is a text in this event that gets passed in. Again, go back to meteor example form if this is confusing to you. And so we're going to do last, addressed, email, and telephone. So we'll make a last, address, address, telephone, email. And then this has got to be last because the label is also used as the value of the name. And then address, and then telephone, and then email, right? So we look in the text form control, okay, the name field, which is what we're actually going to be looking for. If name has been supplied as a parameter, we use that. Otherwise, we're going to say the name is equal to the label, right? And so when we pass in label equals first, that becomes the value that we look for in our event target object. Okay, so that's how that all works. Okay, so now we're going to construct an object with all these values. So we say first, last, address, telephone, email. Okay, and this constructs an object that has like first colon Philip and then last colon Johnson. Right? This is an ES6 construct that says if you only provide the field values, or when you only provide a single value for the key value pair, then this becomes the key, and then the value of this variable becomes the value. Okay, it's sweet that way, really. All right. Now notice that first, last, address, telephone, email corresponds directly to first, last, address, telephone, email. So we've just created an object, right, that mirrors this simple schema structure. And that's the whole trick of this, is that now that we've created this object, we can validate it against our contact schema. And we do that this way. We call this reset validation, just got to do it, and then we clean to make sure that our this object looks the same way as it will be when it's inserted, because it turns out when you insert things into MongoDB, it might remove some fields, and this makes sure that everything looks exactly the same. Then we call validate, and if it's valid, we want to insert it. Okay? And then display success message, we get rid of that. We do want to display error messages, but we don't need to do any of that resetting stuff, because what we're actually going to do when we have a successful situation is go to the home page. But before we do that, let's just remove this success message. And in fact, we don't need this ID, and ESLint is complaining, so we'll just invoke the insert. We don't need to find out the return value from that. Okay, the other thing I want to say is let's refactor this name, because new student data isn't right. It's really new contact data. Okay, just so that things are easier to understand. So we're almost done, hopefully. The problem being that we need to go to the home page. So we're going to use flow router go home page in the event okay, on a successful form submission. Okay, so we need a flow router. We need to import flow router. Pretty sure up here. So I'll say propeller C, and then down here. Okay. Okay, so let's see. So ESLint is passed. We've now defined our event handler when we press the submit button. All that's left is to make sure that everything restarts, which it has. Now let's go into digits and actually try it out. So let's say Edo Biagioni 1680 or 90 east-west, east-est, a little French, 808 945 3333. Let's add another 3 because that's not even looking like a telephone number. And then email esb@hawaii.edu. Let's press submit, and there we go. We've just added the form succeeded, and we've added it to the collection. We've gone to the home page. The home page is retrieving all the elements of the collection. Since Ado is now in the collection, it retrieves it, and we see them. Okay, let's just do one other thing before we end, which is to call the submit button without pressing anything, and we can see we get all of these errors. If we fill out one field and press submit, you can see that one goes away, but the other ones are still there. All right, so that was a 33-minute WOD. Took a while, but there was a lot of extra talking in there while I was explaining things. So I think you can do better than that. We'll call it 30 minutes. Hope you enjoyed this, and do this one maybe a couple times so that you feel comfortable with it.